Hey guys, hope you're having a good day. Matthew, going to be in Matthew chapter 23, starting verse 13. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. So Jesus again and again in this passage says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. So he just repeatedly says this. And first off, he talks about the fact that that they are preventing, instead of leading people toward heaven and helping people to know God, that the scribes and the Pharisees were actually preventing people from getting to know God. And may it be a sad thing said of us as Christians if our actions, rather than what we're called to do, which is win people to Jesus, help people to know who God is, if we're found to be actually preventing people from knowing God, which is the exact opposite of what we've been called to do. And so this is what the Pharisees have done, and the scribes, is instead of helping people know God through their teachings and their writings and through their actions, they actually stand in the way of it. And they use their relationship with God to make themselves look more holy and great than other people. And that should never be the case. As pastors and Christian leaders and just as believers in general, we should be wanting other people to know God. We should be desiring that other people have as good as or a better relationship with God than what we have, rather than holding on to our relationship with God to make us look better and cause people to be dependent on us for things, for prayers, for whatever. And so sad thing that had happened within those that should have been leading people toward God. These should have been the men, and when Jesus showed up, they said, hey guys, here's the Messiah here. We've studied the scriptures, we know he fulfills these. Instead, they're actually standing in the way. In fact, the main thing standing in the way of people coming to know God. And he says again, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Jesus wasn't afraid to call them what they were, okay? Jesus didn't worry about offending people. We're living in a time where much of the things happening by Christian leaders today are many decisions are being made based on not on what is true and what is not true, but on what will offend or not offend, okay? So and when we start to get into that, guys, eventually you ban the Bible, because the Bible has plenty of offensive things to say that really hit us where we live and comment on sin that's in our lives. And so we can't worry about offending or not offending folks, okay? We don't want to be offensive, okay? We don't want to be people who are striving just to be offensive people, but we want to speak the truth. And if people are offended by truth, recognize that it's the truth that offends, not who we are or what we've said. So he goes on, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Wherefore, therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. He said, listen, your judgment's going to be more harsh, because you ought to be the people knowing the truth. They were, would go to a widow, instead of comforting that widow, they would say things like, well, give a tribute of money to your spouse. Now, if somebody wants to do that, that's fine. But as a pastor, I'm not going to go to anybody and say, you need to do this, because, this is what's right for you to do. Now, that's between the person and the Lord. I mean, people do that, give tributes to in memory of their loved one. And there's nothing wrong with that. But a pastor or church should not push people to do those kind of things. I knew a lady years ago that got a settlement from parents who had died, and she had people at her church knocking on her door the next day after they found that out, and began to tell her that she needed to pay for the church's new roof, and the church needed a new van, and they took money from this person who had just gone through a time of loss. I also know folks who are part of the Catholic Church that when their parents died, that the priest, required certain amounts of money, to bury them and these kind of things. One of the things I've never done, there are people who will sometimes walk up to me and say, "Brother Jason, thank you for doing the service for my loved one, and we know this, took time out of your day," and they just come up and hand me a card or something thanking me for preaching that memorial service, and that's a blessing to me, and I appreciate when they do that. But I've never been somebody to say, I'm going to charge you this amount to bury a loved one. That's that to me, that's just something. If they want to do that, that's fine, and I'll accept that. But I'm not going to tell somebody, we're not going to bury your loved one. I'm not going to do the service unless you can come up with a certain amount of money. There was a pastor when I was over in Lake City of another church, and some people called me who I really didn't know that well and asked if I'd do the service for somebody who had passed away, because the pastor of the church they went to, when they went to him and asked him to do the service, he told them that they could not afford him. and their mind was just blown by that. And I said, that's heartbreaking, because some people have money to give, others don't have to give, and again, we shouldn't be telling people you have to do this and trying to use that to manipulate. In days of old in the Catholic Church, there was a time in which a loved one would die, and they would go to the widow and say, that their loved one was in purgatory, and unless the widow gave a certain amount of money, that they would spend eternity separated from God in purgatory and never go to heaven. But if the spouse would come up with, this widow would come up with enough money to pay the priest, then the priest would pray them out of purgatory and into heaven. Now, how anybody can do something like that and manipulate somebody who is already going through a difficult time, I have no idea. It blows your mind that people would use their standing as a pastor or a priest to do such a thing. But church history shows, and I've experienced things in my life that shows that it does happen. So, they did these things. They made long prayers so people would see them making the prayer. When we pray, we don't have to preach a sermon and a prayer. Now, I'm not opposed to long, especially if you're alone praying, to pray as long as you want to. That's a wonderful thing. But sometimes I think people pray certain ways because they want everybody to hear them. That they want to look more spiritual than other people, and that's what was happening with the Pharisees. And again, he says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make twofold more the child of hell than yourselves." He's like, you're converting people to yourself, but not to the Lord, not to God. You're converting them to who you are, and your influence on them is actually making them worse than you are. Okay? And that's the sad thing about liberal pastors, liberal churches, is that they may hold on still to some of the truth, but then when they bring people into the fold, those folks tend to be further away from God and further away from the Bible and more given to social justice things and all these liberal agenda things out there. That they tend to be even worse than what the pastor was. Okay, and we see this push today. Same kind of things going on. These Pharisees bring people into the fold, and when they did, they made them worse than even they were. And so you just see a downhill decline. And we're seeing that in our churches right now. And many of our denominations are just literally being destroyed because some of these seminary professors have taught things, and some of these pastors have taught things, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and further away from the Word of God. He says, "Woe unto you," again, "ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple is nothing, but whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he's a debtor." So, he calls them blind. He said that you're the ones that claim to be able to see the Lord and see the truth, but the reality is you're the blind leading the blind. Okay, so just because somebody has a title, a pastor or church leader or whatever, deacon, whatever it is, in front of their name doesn't mean they know God. And so he said, you're blind leading the blind. And what he gets into this next is kind of some things that were going on at the time where It was all about semantics. It was all about saying the words right. So if somebody said, I swear something made of, swear on something, I swear by the temple, then they could say that, and if it was a lie, they got by with it. But if they swore by the gold of the temple and they told a lie, then they were held accountable for it. And you see the ridiculousness in this. So you could say, I swear by the temple, and tell somebody something is a lie. And if you said just that, you got away with it. It was fine. But if you said, I swear by the gold of the temple, and you lied, then you were in trouble. You were accountable for it. You see how ridiculous it is. It's one of the reasons I believe Jesus said, let your yea be yea, your nay be nay. Don't swear by any of this stuff. Just give an answer. Just tell the truth. Just be honest, instead of using all these. This is kind of like politicians do. They'll tell a lie, but they'll word it in such a way that it seems to be. That if they get called on it, they'll go, well, yeah, but I didn't really say that. Even though they knew what was being asked, they word things in such a way that makes it, technically that they didn't lie. Okay, so this kind of stuff that was going on all the way back here. There's nothing new under the sun, and so they made these kind of statements. He said, "You fools and blind." Calls them fools, calls them blind. For whether is greater, the gold or the temple, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold. He said, so it was ridiculous to make those kind of statements. Whosoever should swear by the altar is nothing, but whosoever swears by the gift that's on it, he is guilty. So that's another thing. They could swear by the altar and lie and get away with it, but if they swore by the gift on the altar, they were in trouble. You fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift. He's saying, you're focused more on the gold and the gifts than you are the temple and the altar itself. And so just he said you're just blind. You're just blind, and you're using words and manipulations to be able to essentially lie and do whatever you want to do, and depending on and then hold other people accountable when they don't do right. It was just a ridiculous thing going on. Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar, swear by it, and by all things thereon. Who shall swear by the temple, swear by it, and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that sweareth by heaven, sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth upon. If you're going to say something, tell the truth. That's what Jesus is getting at. Quit getting into all this stuff of, using certain little key phrases, and then, it's kind of like crossing your fingers and saying, well, I crossed my fingers, so I was all right to do it. If I forgot to cross them, oh, well, this is not Bible. This is not ethical. Okay, it's just using words to twist and do what you want to do. And he says, woe unto you, again, tribes of Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, which was the smallest of the spices, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law. So they would pay tithe of these little small things, but then they were ignoring the things that really mattered, like judgment, mercy, and faith. So they're caught up in these little side things and these little side laws, but the really, really important stuff, they focus on secondary issues, and even some might say third and fourth down the road issues, but yet ignoring the primary things, which in this case he mentions to have judgment, have proper judgment of things, make the right decisions, to show mercy to people, which they never did. The Pharisees were the least merciful people you'd ever find. And faith, to be, walking in faith and causing or leading other people to walk in faith. And you're ignoring those things, but you're tithing these small little things and bragging on your giving, but yet you're not even really living for God. These ought ye have done, and not to leave the other undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. The camel was, or the gnat was seen as the smallest of the unclean animals, okay? And the camel was seen as the largest of the unclean. So in other words, you'd pull a gnat out of your soup, okay? but you'd swallow a camel. So you focus on dealing with the smallest of things, and yet these great things are being ignored. These things that really make a difference are ignored. And so it'd be like, in today's church, that we focus on, everybody come to church and dress your best and come on time and do this and that. But yet, if you have a neighbor in need, you're not going to pay attention to them, or you're not going to pray for each other, or you're going to, but you came to church. So as long as you come to church, you can live however you want to the rest of the week. And I love church, and we ought to come to church. But guys, we don't want to just come to church. We want to come to church, but then we want to live a Christian life when we leave the church. Okay, so let's not get so focused on just the coming to church on Sunday or giving our tithe or whatever, and miss the fact that we're also called to use right judgment. We're called to show mercy. We're called to walk in faith and be praying and trusting God for things, and believing God and living for God. So, in many ways, if we're not careful, we find ourselves living a lot like the Pharisees did. Woe unto you again, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they're full of extortion and excess. These are the things they're doing. I think about, as I read earlier about the widows, think about some of these televangelists, and here he talks about excess. I don't believe it's wrong for a pastor or an evangelist to have some money and to be blessed, okay? But when you see guys who have 12 jet airplanes, you see guys who say they won't fly in a normal airplane because they're full of demons and they don't want to minister to people, and all this kind of stuff. If they're full of demons, why aren't you in there praying for these folks? You ought to be able to. If you're truly this man of faith, you say you are. Why can't you rebuke those demons? Can you only do that in the church building? But you have these televangelists who make promises to people if they'll send in a certain amount of money, and they'll take people who are sick. They'll take people who are poor. They'll take people who are widowed in many cases, some of these older folks who watch the television, and then they extort and they get excess, and they live at a much, much higher standard than any of their congregation. I'm sorry, but a pastor shouldn't be driving a Rolls Royce while the rest of his congregation is driving I don't know, just a Kia or something. Nothing wrong with Kia. Okay, I like Kias; they're fine. But you see what I'm saying? The pastor shouldn't be so far, living in a $1 million home while the bulk of their congregation is barely making it. Okay, so. I'm not saying a pastor can't have a nice car or a nice house or whatever, but when you have this excess, these excesses where millions of dollars, and especially when it's taken from donations, and the pastor is taking all these extravagant vacations and just doing all these things. This is outside. I believe this is outside the will of God. He talks about, and this is how the Pharisees were. They were the elite of the elite. They were running with the big dogs. They were seen as the, almost like Hollywood types, and so many times, sadly, these pastors who do that end up falling into sin eventually because the excess begins to possess them. Their possessions begin to possess them. So then, thou blind Pharisees, he said, look, you've got the outside that looks clean. Okay, so you got the nicest clothes. You're living in the finest homes. You have the big pulpits. Your church buildings are beautiful and they're just wonderful, and they're just. But on the inside, there's no life. You're dirty. Listen, I don't care how clean a bowl is on the outside. If I get ready to make me a bowl of soup and I look on the inside and it's filled with dirt and bugs and whatever, I'm not going to eat out of that bowl, okay? So they cleaned the outside up of their own lives, but yet the inside was still dirty. They weren't allowing God to have control over their life. And guys, listen, we can put on a show on Sunday all we want, show up wearing nice clothes and, putting on a show, but guys, it's not about that. It's about walking with God daily. It's about letting God clean us up on the inside. He says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like the whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, so the tombs, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. He said, listen, you're like a sepulcher. You're beautiful on the outside, but there's death on the inside. There's no life. You're like dead men's bones. You're clothed in these flowing robes, and you have all this, picture of pomp and that everything's wonderful and holy, but on the inside you're dead. You have not the life of God in you. Even so, and you think about John the Baptist, who dressed, wearing camel's hair, and and again, the camel was seen as an unclean animal, so he's eating locusts and wild honey, and he's seen as dirty to them, and yet he had the life of God in him. On the outside, he didn't look like he had it all together, but on the inside, he was walking closer to God than any of the Pharisees and any of the Scribes. And he wasn't, and so you see how that so many times we in an American church put the emphasis on the outward appearance, and yet we fail to realize that it's not the outward, it's the inward that really matters. And so he goes on, he says, even though ye outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within you're full of hypocrisy and iniquity. So you're hypocrites. You say one thing, you do another, and your life is filled with sin. I mean, you live a life that does not glorify God. He says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because ye build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous. So, I mean, they've killed the prophets. Okay, they've these kind of folks wouldn't hear true men of God. They heard only those who said what they wanted to hear, and they're only saying what they want to say that manipulates other people. And then he says, and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we had not have partaken with them the blood of the prophets. They said, we realize our ancestors did, but we wouldn't have done it. Which happened over and over again, the killing of the prophets. Wherefore ye be witnesses unto yourselves that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers. See, they wanted to kill Jesus. And they hated John the Baptist. And eventually they went after all the other disciples. They tried to capture and imprison the disciples. Even the Apostle Paul, before he was saved, worked alongside the Pharisees to try to destroy the church. So they did exactly what they're saying they wouldn't have done. We wouldn't have went after the prophets that our forefathers killed, that Stephen calls them out on, the book of Acts. He said, listen, you're ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell? And Jesus talking some tough words here. He said, how you going to escape the damnation of hell? The reality is, guys, there's only one escape from hell, and that is the Jesus who they're forsaking. The Jesus that they're coming against is their only escape for hell. Okay, so they're rejecting the only way to God. And when you reject Christ, you reject the only way to escape hell. He says, you're vipers. I mean, Jesus is being kind of offensive here, okay? He's not pulling any punches with them. Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them ye shall kill and crucify, including Jesus himself. And some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city. He says that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel. It's the same spirit behind the killing of Abel by Cain, and up into the blood of Zacharias, which is Zechariah, son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. I mean, these great men of God who spoke for the Lord, who spoke on his behalf, and yet they were killed by the very ones who supposedly were supposed to also know God and want to hear from God. He said, you're just like them. And you notice he says, from Abel to Zacharias, you've killed them from A to Z. I mean, I send them along, and what do? You destroy them, you scourge them, you mock them, you won't listen to them over and over again, you won't hear them. That upon you, he says, may come all that righteous blood. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. In AD 70, the Jerusalem will be destroyed. All this that the Pharisees had built up, all their religion, all their pomp, all their money and wealth, everything in just a few years after this would be completely destroyed by the Romans, and they would be taken into captivity, and many would be killed. This that they're holding on to, and yet it's all going to be taken away in just a few short years from then. He says, O Jerusalem, which, Jesus, when he was his heart was breaking. He said this. He said, Simon, Simon. He said, Martha, Martha. Later on, he would say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Why do you persecute the church? Why do you kick against me? He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which is a sign that his heart is breaking, that thou killest the prophets, stonest them which are sent unto thee. And they would continue to do this even after he tells them, Stephen is stoned to death, Peter is killed, hung upside down. All these folks killed by these people. Stonest them which are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathered her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. He said, I've come to gather you together, and you wouldn't have it. You wouldn't listen to me. You rejected me. You rejected me. You're going to reject my followers because you're holding on to your own carnal ways, your own religion that makes you look better, and you're rejecting the truth of God. He says, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. He said, you have an empty house. By the way, when Jesus dies on the cross, the veil in the temple is rent, and they see that the ark is not there, that the glory of God is not there. They're exposed for the facade of all that they've been doing and the excuses they've been making, and it's left desolate. And eventually, again, in a few years later, as I mentioned earlier, all of Jerusalem, including the temple itself, would be destroyed. All their religion is wiped out for over 2,000 years. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth till ye shall say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. You see, the Gentile age will come to an end. God has brought Israel back for what he's talking about here, and what we'll talk about some tomorrow in the next few days in Matthew chapter 24, which is about prophetic end-time events, in that the temple will be destroyed, but then God would bring back in 1948, and then again in 1967, we see an extension of that, an establishment of what happened in 1948, of bringing Israel back into the land, which is the greatest sign of the coming of Jesus, of the end of the Gentile age that it has been, okay? So even with these peace things going on right now in Israel, these are, and the things that Donald Trump did during his time in office, these are all prophetic signs of peace in Israel, okay? Which reveals to us how much closer we are to the rapture of the church, to the second coming of Christ. And when the church is taken, then God begins to deal with Israel specifically again, and they will cry out and say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Israel began to look for Jesus to return. They missed him the first time, but they'll see him when he comes again. And they'll all Israel, the Bible says, in that day shall be saved. All right, guys, we're going to stop right there. Did make it through this whole chapter today. A little longer lesson I've been doing. But I hope you guys have a great night. I want to get into Matthew 24 tomorrow. Looking forward to that. God bless y'all.